I rise today to speak in opposition to the proposed reauthorization of the expiring provisions of the PATRIOT Act incorporated in S. 1038. I have to say I find reauthorization especially troubling since we've waited until the last minute and are now being told that we must rush this bill through the Senate of the United States. There are a number of the PATRIOT Act provisions that are permanent, and they remain in place to give our intelligence community important tools to fight terrorism. But there are three controversial provisions that we're debating, commonly known as roving wiretap, lone wolf, and business records. And I have to tell you, at least from my point of view, and I think there are the senators here that agree with me, they're ripe for abuse, and they threaten Americans' constitutional freedoms. Now, as I start my remarks at the onset, I want to state that I firmly believe, as we all do, that terrorism is a serious threat to our great country, the United States, and we have to be focused like no other time in our history in seeking to protect our people, the American people. I sit on the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Intelligence Committee, and on those two committees, much of my attention is centered on keeping Americans safe, both here and abroad. And I recognize that despite bin Laden's death, and we all celebrate because justice was delivered, we still live in a world where terrorism is a serious threat to our country, our economy, and to American lives. Our government does need the appropriate surveillance and anti-terrorism tools to achieve these important goals. And indeed, many of the PATRIOT Act's provisions, which I support, have made our nation safer since those devastating attacks on that day we'll always remember on 9/11. We know that for a fact. But the problem we confront today is that there are three provisions that we're debating that fail to strike the right balance between keeping us safe while protecting the privacy rights of Coloradans and all Americans. Instead, these three provisions are far too susceptible to abuse by the federal government, even in the name of keeping us safe from terrorism. I don't say this lightly, but my concerns about some of these provisions have only grown since I've been briefed on their interpretation and their implementation as a member of the Intelligence Committee. Let me share some examples. Currently, the intelligence community can place wide-ranging wiretaps on Americans without even identifying the target or the location of such surveillance. That's one concern. A second concern, the intelligence community can target individuals who have no connection to terrorist organizations. And a third concern that I have is they can collect business records on law-abiding Americans who have no connection to terrorism. We ought to be able to at least agree that the source of an investigation under the PATRIOT Act should have a terrorist-related focus. If we can't limit investigations to terrorism, my concern is, where do they end? Is there no amount of information that our government can collect that should be off limits? I know Coloradans are demanding that we at least place common sense limits on government investigations and link data collection to terrorist-related activities. If we pass this bill, Mr. President, to extend the PATRIOT Act till 2015, it would mean that for 4 more years, the federal government will continue to have unrestrained access to private information about Americans who have no connection to terrorism, with little to no accountability as to how these powers are used. And again, I want to go back to this. We all agree the intelligence community needs effective tools to combat terrorism. But we must provide those tools in a way that protects the constitutional freedoms of our people and lives up to the standard of transparency that democracy demands. The three controversial provisions that I've mentioned can be much better balanced to protect our people. Yet, it seems to me that many of our colleagues oppose any changes, and by making the PATRIOT Act provisions I've outlined permanent, we would be in effect preventing debate on them ever again. To travel that path would be to threaten constitutional and civil liberties that we hold dear in this country. That's not the right path. Mr. President, let me be clear. I do not oppose the reauthorization of these three provisions of the PATRIOT Act, but I do aim to bring forward some common sense reforms that will allow us to strike an important balance between keeping our nation safe on the one hand while also protecting privacy and civil liberties. And toward that goal, I've worked side by side with my colleagues in coming up with common sense fixes that could receive bipartisan support. One example, Senator Wyden from Oregon has filed an amendment which I've co-sponsored that would require that the Department of Justice disclose to Congress the official legal interpretation of the provisions of the PATRIOT Act. While I believe that our intelligence practices should be kept secret, I do not believe that the government's official interpretation of these laws should be kept secret. I've also filed my own amendments to address some of the problems I see with the three expiring provisions. The first amendment I've filed is bipartisan with Senator Paul of Kentucky, who's on the floor, and Senator Wyden, who's joined us as well. Our amendment would modify the roving wiretap authority under Section 206 of the PATRIOT Act. Specifically, our bipartisan amendment will require intelligence agencies to identify either the target or the place to be wiretapped. They currently do not have to do so. And I believe that when seeking to collect intelligence, law enforcement should at least have to identify who is being targeted. I've also filed an amendment to address the so-called lone wolf provision, which currently allows the government to conduct wiretap surveillance on individuals even when that person has no connection to a government or a terrorist organization. This amendment would simply require that should the intelligence community use the lone wolf provision, that Congress simply be notified. Again, a safeguard that is not in place as we stand here today. Without safeguards like that, how do we in this body conduct our constitutional duties of oversight? Finally, I was joined by Senator Wyden in filing an amendment designed to narrow the scope of business record materials that can be collected under Section 215 of the PATRIOT Act. This amendment would still allow law enforcement to use the PATRIOT Act to obtain such records, but would require these entities to demonstrate that the records are in some way connected to terrorism or clandestine intelligence activities. Right now, Mr. President, law enforcement can currently obtain any kind of records. In fact, the PATRIOT Act's only limitation states that such information has to be related to any tangible thing. That's right. As long as these business records are related to any tangible thing, the U.S. government can require businesses to turn over information on all of their customers, whether or not there's any link to terrorism.
Would my colleague yield for a question very briefly?
Yes.
It seems to me that you have laid out the case for why there needs to be a thoughtful debate about the PATRIOT Act and what's necessary to strike this key balance between fighting terrorism ferociously and protecting our liberties. I'm interested in what my colleague thinks about the proposition of how you have a thoughtful debate on these issues when there is secret law, where in effect the interpretation of the law as it stands today is kept secret. So here we are, United States senators on the floor, and we've had colleagues of both political parties wanting to participate in this. Certainly if you're an American, you're in Oregon or Colorado, you're listening in, you want to be part of this discussion, but yet the executive branch keeps secret how they are interpreting the law. What's your sense about how we have a thoughtful debate if that continues?
The senator from Oregon's put his finger on why this is so important, not only have the debate here on the floor and not rush these provisions to the House because of a deadline that I think we could push back. We could, as you know, extend the PATRIOT Act in its present form for a number of other days or a number of weeks in order to get this right. But the senator from Oregon makes the powerful point that the law shouldn't be classified as far as its interpretation goes. Of course, we can protect sources and methods and operations, as we well should. Both of us serve on the Intelligence Committee. We're privy to some information that should be kept classified, but we've come to the floor to make this case because of what we've learned on the Intelligence Committee. I thank the senator for his question. I look forward to his comments in a few minutes. the senator from Oregon, in effect, points out that these are just a few of the reform ideas that we could debate. But without further debate on any of these issues, this or any other administration can abuse the PATRIOT Act and could actually deny us as members of Congress, whether in this Congress or future Congresses, the opportunity to fulfill our oversight responsibilities on behalf of the American people. Mr. President, when I voted against the original passage of the PATRIOT Act in 2001, and I plan to vote against the reauthorization of these expiring provisions this week, unless we implement some reforms that will sensibly restrain these overly broad provisions. Simply put, again, to make the point that the senator from Oregon made so importantly, I believe that Congress is granting powers to the executive branch that lead to abuse and, frankly, shield the executive branch from accountability. There have been 10 years since we first passed this law, and there's been very little opportunity to improve the law. And I just resist this rush to, again, rubber stamp policies that threaten the very liberty that we hold dear. I recently supported short-term extensions of the expiring provisions before us as a bridge to take time and debate and amend the PATRIOT Act and its controversial provisions. But we were notified, unfortunately, just a few days ago that we'd be voting on a 4-year extension of these expiring provisions, and that's just not the way to ensure that Americans, that we're diligently considering these important public decisions. In Federalist 51, James Madison, who we venerate, who was the author of many of the documents that structure and way in which we organize and operate our democracy, he wrote, quote, "In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." The bill before us does not live up to that standard, and I believe it seriously risks the constitutional freedoms of our people. We need to strike a better balance between giving our national security and law enforcement officials the tools necessary to keep us safe while not damaging the very Constitution we have sworn to support and defend. By passing an unamended reauthorization, we are assuring that Americans will live with the status quo for 4 more long years. And I believe this bill may well be a lost opportunity to improve the balance between our security and our civil liberties. That's not the result that our founding fathers envisioned, and it's not a result that our constituents want. And for these reasons, if the PATRIOT Act provisions are not amended, I plan to vote no on the motion to invoke cloture and on passage of S. 1038. Before I yield the floor, Mr. President, I want to make one last historical reference. Ben Franklin, one of our founding fathers, said compellingly and presciently, he said, "A society that would sacrifice essential liberties for short-term security deserves neither." I think that's the question before us. There's a way forward. There's a way to keep the PATRIOT Act in place to protect our national security, but also to protect our essential liberties. But in order to do that, we have to have a chance to debate and pass these important amendments. Mr. President, I yield the floor.